Today we are going to talk about one of the most controversial issues, alleged Armenian genocide. This video will try to explore whether Turks committed a genocide against Armenians or not. In order to find the true answer, we will closely look at the casualties of both sides, and how it is related to the reality. According to Armenians, the number of Ottoman Armenians killed as a result of the Turkish relocation plans was no less than 1.5 million. Taking into consideration the total population of Armenians living on the Turkish soil towards the start of the First World War, as quoted by neutral sources, this figure of 1.5 million deaths is certainly an over-exaggeration. Apparently, the figures have been concocted by Armenian sources so as to give hyperbolic dimensions to a tragedy that was primarily the creation of the Armenians themselves. The Armenian terrorist organizations and their Western supporters are not prepared to acknowledge this fact because all along, they have been exploiting this bloated figure, firstly to solicit the sympathy and philanthropy of the Western world, and secondly to create hatred against the Muslim Turks in the hearts of the Christian public in these countries. The great powers also used these exaggerated figures in order to tempt the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire to revolt and break away from the Ottomans. In order to justify this exaggerated figure, the Armenians maintained that the number of those who were uprooted from their homes in Eastern Anatolia was much higher than the number of quoted by Turkish sources. They also maintained that the number of Armenians who safely reached their destinations was much smaller than the figure provided by the Turks. As far as the documents available on the subject in the Ottoman archives are concerned, they reveal that the total of 438.758 Armenians were made to leave their homes for resettlement in new locations. Of these, 382.148, which is roughly 87%, reached their destinations in good shape, leaving a total of 56.610 evacuees unaccounted for. That more than two-thirds of the total number arrived safely at the destination is a sure proof of the fact that genocide was not officially intended. A number of factors could have been responsible for the disappearance of the remaining 56.610 Armenians. Firstly, the Turks do acknowledge the fact that in spite of all the possible security measures that the Ottoman government had adopted for protecting the Armenians on move to their new destinations, many groups were subjected to attacks by armed marauders during the long and arduous journey, resulting in the killing of an unknown number of Armenians. In some cases, the attackers belonged to Arab tribesmen motivated by their greed for pillage. There were also many cases of Turkish gangs launching attacks against the Armenians. As stated earlier, these attacks could have been retaliatory in nature, launched by aggrieved Muslims to avenge the barbarities that the Armenian terrorists had been perpetrating upon their kith and kin for many months prior to the relocation operation. When it came to light that some officials were also involved in instigating others for such attacks, they were all dealt with very severely by the Ottoman authorities. Coming back to the figure of 1.5 million Armenian deaths during the relocation of 1915, this figure is not supported by authentic documents. It has been challenged, not only by Turkish sources but also by a number of Western writers. One such writer is Samuel Weems, an American author. In one of his books, Weems referred to U.S. estimates according to which many more than 1 million Armenians were still living in the Ottoman Empire in the year 1916, despite the alleged 1.5 million who are supposed to have been killed by the Turks in 1915. To prove that the figure of 1.5 million was highly exaggerated, Weems adds to this figure, another 1 million Armenians reported to be living in the Ottoman Empire in 1916, plus another 1.76 million living in the Azerbaijan-Georgia-Armenia region. That makes a total of 4.26 million Armenians. Add to this number the hundreds of thousands of Armenians then living in many other countries of the Middle East like Iran, Iraq, Syria, etc., and that would give a fantastic figure of the total Armenian population before so-called genocide. From these figures, Weems arrives at the logical conclusion that there were just too many Armenian Christians alive in 1916 to have had 1.5 million of them killed in 1915. It would be interesting to know that the number of Armenians supposed to have been killed during the so-called genocide has been increasing with time. Immediately after the war, the Armenians claimed that 600.000 of their kith and kin had been slaughtered. This figure was later on raised to 800.000, only to be raised to 1.2 million by Armenian writer Dadrian, who says, surviving official Ottoman documents as well as documents from the archives of the empire's wartime allies, Germany and Austria-Hungary, indicate that the extermination of the Ottoman Armenians was premeditated and centrally organized by the Young Turk regime. As many as 1.2 million Ottoman Armenians perished, out of a pre-war Armenian population estimated at 1.8 million. This figure also seems to have fallen short of the target fixed by the Armenians, who raised it further to 1.5 million. The 1918 edition of Encyclopaedia Britannica gave the figure of 600,000, but then following in the footsteps of the Armenian writers, it had to raise this modest figure to 1.5 million in its 1968 edition. Still more interesting are the figures quoted by various Armenian and Western sources about the estimated Armenian population in the Ottoman Empire as on the eve of the First World War. In comparison with the figure 1,295,000 as per the official Ottoman census of 1914, the Armenians claimed that their population at that time was between 2.3 and 2.56 million. The Armenian National Committee at the Paris Peace Conference realized that their fellow Armenians had been exaggerating the figure. So it reduced the total Armenian population, bringing it to 2.25 million. The Western sources are comparatively more realistic in their estimates. According to them, the Armenian population varied between 1.05 and 1.55 million. Accepting these as reasonably accurate estimates, the genocide of 1.5 million Armenians appears to be ridiculously impossible to believe. Could every single Armenian in the Ottoman Empire have been put to the death by any chance? Of course that was not the case. Surely, the figure of 1.5 million has been intentionally exaggerated so as to stretch the tragedy to genocidal dimensions. Another Western writer, Professor Justin McCarthy, has refuted the charge of planned genocide in a number of papers written by him on the subject and in his lectures dealing with the Armenian question delivered from time to time at various forums. He maintains that Turks and Armenians who had been living in the Ottoman Empire as good neighbors for hundreds of years, got mutually engaged in a prolonged two-sided conflict with each other after a certain date in history, that the result was horrible mortality on both sides, and unless one can speak of war as mutual genocide, there was no genocide. McCarthy also concludes that as far as can be seen, there never was an Ottoman government order to kill the Armenians. The intentional manipulation of statistics concerning the total Armenian population and the number of deaths during the alleged genocide is one of the worst examples of intellectual dishonesty on the part of the Armenians to suit their specific purposes. They have very cleverly attributed to hostile Turkish action all deaths among Ottoman Armenians due to causes such as diseases, epidemics, and climate conditions. Similarly, Armenian casualties of regular wars and countless irregular operations conducted by them, deaths of Armenian rebels during official counterinsurgency operations, and ethnic conflicts between opposing groups of Armenians and Turkish people have also been intentionally debited to the genocide account. It would be reasonable to assume that a large number of Armenians must have died in all these armed conflicts. Armenian propaganda organs as well as those of their supporters are guilty of deliberately putting the loss of Armenian lives during these operations in the genocide account, thereby giving a manipulated boost to the total number of Armenians alleged to have been subjected to genocide. Obviously, this is not fair,